Okinawa, June 1945. The cave stank of smoke and blood. The air was heavy, thick with gunpowder and silence. Outside, the island burned. Inside, a Japanese commander knelt against the cold stone, his left arm bound with a torn flag. Around him, a handful of soldiers whispered final prayers. The last grenades were ready. The last bullets counted. For days they had fought without food, without hope. Yet the code of Bushido left no room for surrender. Death was duty. Capture was shame. And so they waited for the inevitable. The thunder of flamethrowers, the roar of tanks, the searing light that would swallow everything. Then came a sound none of them expected. From beyond the cave mouth, through the smoke and rain, came a voice. Calm, clear, in perfect Japanese. Commander. Your men have fought bravely. The wounded will be treated. Step out. No one will harm you. The soldiers froze. Even the dying turned their heads. The commander's eyes widened. That voice, and it wasn't one of his men, it was American. And for the first time in years of war, the enemy spoke his language. When the Pacific War erupted in December 1941, it was more than a clash of armies. It was a collision of worlds, of values, codes, and languages that neither side fully understood. For the Japanese soldier, the word surrender was not in the vocabulary of honor. Generations had been raised under the creed of Bushido, the warrior's way, that placed loyalty above life and death above disgrace. To die for the emperor was not tragedy. It was destiny. From the blood-soaked sands of Tarawa to the jungles of New Guinea, American troops learned this lesson the hard way. The enemy would fight to the last man, the last bullet, and when cornered would take their own lives rather than face capture. This mindset baffled the Americans. Early in the war, U.S. intelligence could barely read captured documents or understand intercepted messages. Even interrogation was impossible. Few Japanese soldiers would speak, and fewer still survived long enough to be questioned. The language barrier was a wall, and behind it lay the secrets of a vast and disciplined enemy. In 1942, as battles raged across the Pacific, a quiet effort began in the United States, one that would ultimately alter the course of the war. From Hawaii to California, the U.S. Army began recruiting young Japanese Americans, the sons of immigrants, to serve not with rifles, but with words. They were second-generation citizens known as Nisei, and many of them had families imprisoned in internment camps by the very government that now called upon them. They answered anyway. At Camp Savage, Minnesota, and later Fort Snelling, these Nisei recruits endured months of intense training. They studied military terminology, dialects from Kyushu to Hokkaido, and the subtle codes of respect embedded in every Japanese phrase. They translated captured diaries, maps, and radio logs. They learned how to speak in tones that could command but comfort. They became the bridge between two warring cultures. By 1943, their first test came on the island of New Guinea. American troops were bogged down, their supply lines thin, their intelligence blind. A group of MIS, Military Intelligence Service linguists, joined frontline units. Within days, they translated intercepted orders that revealed Japanese troop movements, allowing Allied forces to strike before being surrounded. It was the first quiet victory of language over steel. From that moment onward, the Nisei interpreters traveled wherever the war burned hottest: Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima, and eventually Okinawa. They interrogated prisoners, intercepted transmissions, and often stood between life and death, persuading enemy soldiers to surrender before annihilation. But their mission was more than tactical. It was deeply human. They understood the silence of fear in a captured officer's eyes, the tremor in a soldier's voice when he whispered the word "Gomen," forgive me. They understood that for many Japanese, surrender was not cowardice. It was the collapse of everything they had been taught to believe. Meanwhile, on the American side, few knew these linguists even existed. Their work was secret, their identities classified. They were the invisible translators of a war fought in shadows, where every word could mean a life saved or lost. By 1945, as the war neared its final chapter, the island of Okinawa became the ultimate test of their purpose. The largest amphibious assault of the Pacific, it was meant to open the path to Japan itself. But Okinawa was no ordinary battlefield. It was a fortress carved in limestone, its caves filled with civilians and soldiers ready to die together. In that maze of tunnels and cliffs, the U.S. Army would discover that guns alone could not end this war. The real weapon, the one capable of piercing centuries of honor and indoctrination, was understanding. And it would come, not from a general or a bomb, but from a voice that could speak Japanese, a voice that could reach through the darkness and be heard. The Military Intelligence Service, by 1945, had grown into one of the most remarkable and least recognized units in American military history. Over 6,000 Nisei linguists were serving across the Pacific. They were scattered among divisions, naval units, and even special forces, translating enemy plans, interrogating prisoners, and intercepting radio traffic that saved thousands of lives. Their fluency, however, was more than linguistic. It was cultural. They knew the subtle power of a pause in speech, the weight of honorifics, and the difference between a command and a plea. In war, such nuances could open doors no weapon could. At Camp Savage, the instructors drilled them relentlessly. A single mistranslation could cost a battle. They learned the dialects of southern fishermen and northern farmers, the clipped tones of naval officers, and the archaic phrasing of imperial dispatches. They memorized everything, from how a Japanese captain might sign a death poem to how a private would stammer when lying. For the U.S. Army, these were not simply translators. They were psychological weapons. Their reports provided insights no machine or codebreaker could replicate. When Japanese troops prepared for banzai charges, Nisei linguists intercepted the orders. When messages hinted at hidden ammo dumps or tunnel systems, they decoded them with instinct born of heritage. But their greatest challenge wasn't the enemy. It was trust. Many of the Nisei interpreters had been labeled enemy aliens only months before. Some had parents behind barbed wire at Manzanar, Tula Lake, or Heart Mountain. The paradox was staggering: to fight for a country that doubted your loyalty. Yet one by one they volunteered, believing that honor could be rebuilt not through anger but through service. On the front lines, that loyalty was tested under fire. American infantrymen, at first suspicious, soon learned how vital these interpreters were. They saw Nisei soldiers walking toward caves with loudspeakers, calling for surrender in voices filled with compassion rather than hatred. They saw how sometimes those voices worked, how enemy soldiers, broken by exhaustion and fear, emerged from the darkness clutching white rags, trembling yet alive. In Saipan 1944, Nisei linguists helped persuade hundreds of civilians hiding in cliffs to step forward instead of leaping to their deaths. The Japanese command had told them that Americans were monsters who tortured and killed captives. When the interpreters spoke softly in their own language, promising food, safety, and medical care, many hesitated and chose life. That moment, unseen by the cameras, saved not only lives but the humanity of those who listened. By 1945, the war had entered its deadliest stage. The Battle of Okinawa was the last obstacle before the planned invasion of the Japanese mainland. Over 180,000 U.S. troops faced nearly 100,000 Japanese defenders entrenched in caves, tunnels, and ridges, fortified with concrete and steel. Among them were civilians, old men, women, children, all bound by the same imperial propaganda that glorified death over defeat. For American commanders, conventional warfare made little sense here. Every assault on a cave complex cost dozens of lives. Flamethrowers and explosives could clear a tunnel, but at horrific human cost. The intelligence reports were grim. Suicide attacks, booby traps, and entire units preferring ritual suicide to surrender. That was when the Nisei interpreters were brought forward again. Their mission was simple in wording, impossible in practice: to make the enemy surrender. Armed not with rifles but with megaphones and courage, they crawled to the mouths of caves, shouting words that no American voice had ever spoken in such a place before. They appealed to reason, to family, to faith. They called commanders by name, promising dignity and safety for those who lived. They quoted Japanese military oaths and poems, reminding the soldiers that loyalty could be shown not only in dying for one's men, but in keeping them alive. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But each attempt carved a small crack in the armor of silence that had defined the Japanese defense. And in one cave, high in the hills above Okinawa's southern coast, that crack would open fully, when a wounded commander, surrounded by his dying men, would hear an American voice unlike any other, the voice of someone who spoke not as an enemy, but as one of their own. The human angle. The dual identity of the Nisei. To understand what happened in those caves, one must first understand the men who spoke into them. The Nisei linguists lived between two worlds, American by birth, Japanese by blood. They carried both pride and pain. When the United States declared war on Japan, these young men suddenly found their heritage turned against them. Storefronts banned them, neighbors whispered. Their families were herded into internment camps guarded by American soldiers. Yet in the same breath, the U.S. Army asked them to serve, to use the very language of the enemy. For most, the choice was not easy. But for many, service became a statement, a way to prove that loyalty was not determined by ancestry. Let us fight, they said. Let us show them what being American means. And so they did, not with rifles, but with words. In the jungles of Burma and the beaches of the Philippines, they knelt beside captured soldiers and spoke gently in Japanese. Many of the enemy wept. For some, it was the first human voice they had heard since the war began, one that didn't come from an officer shouting commands or propaganda screaming defiance. To the Nisei, every surrender was a victory of compassion, but it came at a cost. Each time they spoke, they were reminded of the faces they might have known, uncles, cousins, even brothers across the sea. They weren't shouting at faceless enemies. They were speaking to men who looked like family. One interpreter, Sergeant Grant Ichikawa, later recalled, "When I called into those caves, I could hear the hesitation. The silence was louder than gunfire. They didn't expect anyone to understand them. And when they realized I did, something inside them broke. This was the emotional battlefield, unseen, unrecorded, but fought with every word. The tactical angle, language as a weapon while the human element was powerful. The tactical implications of language warfare were profound. Every intercepted order, every decoded map, and every interrogated prisoner shaped American strategy in the Pacific. By 1944, Japanese command structures were still disciplined but increasingly fractured. Supply lines were collapsing, morale was breaking, yet communications remained dangerously efficient. The U.S. could break radio codes, but understanding the context, military idioms, abbreviations, even poetry embedded in dispatches, required a fluent mind. That was where the Nisei linguists became indispensable. They could read between the lines, literally. A single character could mean attack or advance depending on the phrasing. A captured letter might reveal troop morale or hidden orders disguised as personal messages. These interpreters gave U.S. commanders the ability to anticipate enemy moves hours, sometimes days, in advance. On Saipan, one translation of a captured map revealed a hidden ammunition depot buried beneath a cliff. A precision airstrike destroyed it before it could supply a counterattack. On Leyte, a translated radio order exposed the timing of a planned Japanese naval reinforcement. American submarines were waiting, but even more critical was the use of psychological broadcasting. Loudspeakers and leaflets dropped behind lines. The messages, spoken in native-level Japanese, urged soldiers to surrender, offering them food, medicine, and humane treatment. They quoted imperial rescripts and used respectful tones, avoiding the arrogance of propaganda. These broadcasts did what bullets could not. They reached the heart. Many Japanese soldiers wrote farewell notes before surrendering, convinced their families would disown them. But some came forward nonetheless, holding makeshift white flags, whispering thanks to the unseen voice that had given them permission to live. The army soon realized that every interpreter was worth more than a battalion of men in the field. They could win battles without firing a shot. The psychological angle, breaking the code of death. The Japanese Imperial Army had conditioned its soldiers to believe that capture was worse than death. From early training, recruits were told that surrender disgraced their ancestors and shamed their emperor. Leaflets and speeches drilled into them that the Americans were barbarians, that torture, mutilation, and execution awaited any who gave up. So even when surrounded, many chose suicide. They jumped off cliffs. They used grenades on themselves. They charged hopelessly into gunfire to die with honor. This was not mere obedience, it was spiritual conditioning. And it terrified American commanders. How could you negotiate with men who refused life itself? Language was the only key. When a Nisei interpreter spoke, he shattered the illusion that Americans were monsters. His accent, his phrasing, his understanding of cultural nuance, it disarmed the fear. To a Japanese soldier crouched in a cave, hearing an American voice use words of respect like anata or taicho was unimaginable. It created confusion, hesitation, and in that hesitation lay the chance for mercy. At first, few believed it. Some thought the voices were tricks, phonographs or captured soldiers being forced to speak. But as interpreters repeated the same messages, as they called individual officers by name or referenced family villages they knew, reality set in. The Americans were not just shouting orders. They were communicating. A few seconds of silence could stretch into a lifetime decision, to fight, to die, or to surrender. One interpreter described it later as speaking into darkness, hoping the darkness would answer. Sometimes it did. A voice trembling back from the cave, pleading for conditions, for safety, for assurance that humanity still existed beyond the smoke. Each time, it was a small miracle, not of faith but of language. The enemy angle. When the voice was familiar to the Japanese soldiers trapped in the caves of Okinawa, the war had long ceased to be about victory. They were starving, bleeding, and alone, but their commanders had drilled them with one unbreakable command. Never surrender. Die as soldiers of the Emperor. So when the American loudspeakers began echoing through the ridges, many thought it was deception, another cruel trick. But what unnerved them most wasn't the message. It was the voice. It didn't sound foreign. The tone, the inflection, the rhythm, it was unmistakably Japanese. In one account preserved by the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division, several prisoners later admitted they hesitated not because they doubted the words, but because they recognized something deeply human in them. One said, "It was as if my brother were calling from home." For Japanese commanders, this was more than confusion. It was disorientation. The line between ally and enemy blurred. If Americans could speak their language in war and speak it correctly with reverence and empathy, then what else had they misunderstood about the war itself? The psychological tremor was immense. Centuries of cultural isolation had taught the Japanese to view outsiders as fundamentally other. But this voice from the darkness broke that illusion. It was fluent, precise, and familiar. It used phrases reserved for officers. It bowed and verbally before commanding. It was a conversation between equals, not conquerors and captives. In that moment, the power of propaganda collapsed. The enemy, once faceless and monstrous, had learned how to speak and to understand. The leadership angle, the generals who believed in words, while most of the Pacific War was commanded through steel and firepower, a few American leaders understood that information, not ammunition, was the ultimate weapon. One of them was General Douglas MacArthur. As early as 1942, MacArthur recognized that the Pacific Campaign was not just a military struggle, but a psychological one. His staff included experts like Colonel Sidney Mashbeer, a linguist who had lived in Japan before the war, and later led the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS. Under his command, hundreds of Nisei linguists were deployed directly to combat zones. Mashbeer often said, "To win a war, you must understand the mind of your enemy." He treated interpreters not as mere translators but as field intelligence officers. They carried microphones instead of rifles, but their words could save more lives than artillery. Commanders learned to rely on them. Before assaults on fortified ridges, linguists were sent forward to call for surrender. When interrogations yielded enemy maps or orders, entire operations were adjusted. Even in Washington, military planners began to recognize the tactical advantage. By late 1944, reports from the field showed that every major engagement using Nisei interpreters resulted in more prisoners and fewer American casualties, but not everyone approved. Some field officers dismissed linguistic warfare as soft tactics. They trusted firepower, not persuasion. Yet after Okinawa, no one doubted its power. When hundreds of Japanese soldiers surrendered from the southern caves after hearing broadcast messages, generals realized the truth. Communication could end wars faster than bombs. And behind those victories were men whose faces never appeared in the newspapers, whose names were often classified for decades. Their weapons were words. Their courage was silence. The moral angle between mercy and manipulation. Language in war walks a fragile line between compassion and control. Every word spoken into a cave could be an act of mercy or a form of psychological pressure. The Americans knew it. The interpreters felt it. When a Nisei soldier spoke into enemy positions, he wasn't only appealing to humanity. He was dismantling the moral armor that had kept those soldiers fighting. The promise of safety, food, and medical care was genuine, but it was also a tactical ploy. Each surrender meant one less pocket of resistance, one less firefight, one more step toward ending the war. Was it manipulation? Or mercy? For the interpreters, the question lingered long after the battle ended. Some confessed that they saw faces of the men who walked out, trembling, clutching photographs of wives and children. They wondered how many lives were spared because they had chosen the right words. Others admitted to sleepless nights, remembering those who ignored their pleas and perished moments later under American fire. Yet through the fog of moral uncertainty, one truth remained. Language had restored something the war had almost destroyed: the idea that enemies could still understand one another. In those caves, where honor and death had once ruled without mercy, a few simple sentences in perfect Japanese gave men a reason to live. And among those moments, one stood apart, a story whispered among veterans for decades, of a commander who, against every oath and instinct, chose life when he heard an American speak the language of his homeland. That surrender, quiet and unseen, would come to symbolize not just the power of translation, but the power of recognition. Because in the end, it wasn't the words themselves that changed him. It was realizing that someone on the other side had cared enough to learn them. Okinawa, June 17, 1945. The rain had not stopped for days. It fell in a steady whisper over shattered hills and broken palm trunks. The American 96th Infantry Division had pushed south, yard by yard, toward the limestone ridges overlooking the sea. Beneath those ridges lay a labyrinth of caves, the final strongholds of the Japanese 32nd Army. Thousands had already died. Those who remained would rather burn than bow. The Americans called them the Tomb Caves. Inside one of them, deep under the coral rock near the village of Mabuni, Lieutenant Colonel Hiromichi Yahara and his remaining troops waited in darkness. They were exhausted, surrounded, and out of ammunition. The stench of decay clung to their uniforms. Each man held a grenade, not to throw but to die with. Yahara, an officer known for his discipline, had already written his death poem. He believed it was time. Outside, the Americans prepared the final assault. Engineers loaded flamethrowers. Mortar teams aligned targets. The order was clear: seal the caves. But one officer hesitated. He had seen too much death already. And with him stood a young Nisei interpreter, Technical Sergeant Richard Dick Ogata, a linguist with the Military Intelligence Service. His job was to translate surrendered prisoners and decode documents. But now he was asked for something different. A megaphone was handed to him. Ogata adjusted the strap of his helmet and took a slow breath. The cave mouth was 30 yards away, black, silent, waiting. The men around him watched, uncertain. He spoke, his voice cut through the rain, steady and formal. "Colonel Yahara, this is the United States Army. Your men have fought bravely and honorably. The wounded will be cared for. The war for you can end today, and with life, not death." The words echoed inside the cave, no answer. Only the drip of water. He spoke again, using the dialect of Kyoto, soft, respectful, unmistakably Japanese. "You have fulfilled your duty to the Emperor. To die now serves no purpose. Your men can still live, to rebuild Japan, to care for your families. We will treat you as soldiers, not prisoners." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then a faint voice answered. Rough. Suspicious. "Who are you? Are you truly Japanese?" Ogata hesitated. "I am American," he replied. "But I was born in a Japanese home. I speak to you as one who understands your heart." There was silence again. Then another voice, weaker, almost trembling. "If we come out, will you shoot?" Ogata turned to the American captain beside him. The captain nodded. They would hold fire. "No one will harm you," Ogata called. "Come without weapons. You will live." The rain fell harder. For 5 minutes no one spoke. Then slowly, impossibly, a shadow appeared at the cave mouth. A man in tattered uniform, bandaged arm hanging loose, stepping into the light. Behind him, 2 more followed, holding a makeshift white flag, a torn undershirt tied to a rifle. American rifles tensed, but no one fired. Ogata kept his voice steady. "Tell your commander to come. We will keep our word." The soldiers turned and disappeared back inside. Minutes later, the cave exhaled a dozen more figures, thin, hollow-eyed, carrying stretchers. And finally, a man limped out, supported by 2 aides. His uniform was scorched, his sword missing, his face unreadable. Lieutenant Colonel Yahara stopped in the mud and raised his hand. A weak salute. Ogata stepped forward. For a moment, the 2 men stared at each other. One born in Tokyo, the other in California. Separated by fate, united by language. No shots. No shouting. Just rain and silence. Yahara spoke quietly. "I believed Americans did not understand honor." Ogata bowed his head. "Perhaps we both misunderstood." And with that, the commander of the last intact Japanese regiment on Okinawa surrendered. Not to bombs or bullets, but to words. That moment rippled through the lines. Word spread quickly. A Japanese officer had surrendered after hearing an American speak his language. For the first time, the pattern of mass suicide slowed. Other soldiers began waving rags, crawling out, dropping their weapons. No one could explain it at first. But those who heard that voice through the rain never forgot it. The U.S. report filed that evening simply read, "Cave secured. 23 prisoners taken alive. No casualties." It was the shortest report of the entire Okinawa campaign, and perhaps the most extraordinary. The hills fell silent that night. But deep inside the caves, more men still waited, undecided, torn between honor and survival. And the interpreter, exhausted and trembling, knew his work was not done, because once you have spoken life into death, there is no going back. The next morning, the mist hung low over the ridges of Mabuni. Smoke rose in thin ribbons from the shattered hills, carrying the smell of burned fuel and wet limestone. The Americans advanced carefully, rifles raised. Every cave could still hide a gun or a grenade. But something was changing. The cries of Tenohika Banzai, that had echoed for weeks, began to fade. In their place came muffled calls for Isha, doctor. Surrender flags, crude and trembling, fluttered at the mouths of dark tunnels. The interpreters of the Military Intelligence Service, many of them sons of Japanese immigrants, spread across the battlefield. They carried no weapons, only megaphones and courage. Their mission was simple and impossible: to break the silence of a defeated army without losing their lives in the process. Among them was Technical Sergeant Ogata, now covered in mud, his throat raw from shouting through rain and explosions. His voice had already saved one cave, but nearby there were hundreds more. Each word could mean life, each misstep, death. That morning the men approached another cavern, a deep slit in the ridge half hidden by roots. Inside, scouts had spotted movement. The radio crackled. "Flame team ready." The order was seconds away. Ogata stepped forward again. "Wait. Let me try first." The captain hesitated. "You sure about this?" Ogata nodded. He picked up the megaphone, took cover behind a rock, and called out in Japanese, "We know you are there. You have fought with honor. Step forward and we will not harm you." No answer. Then was shot. A single round cracked against the rock near his head. The men ducked. Ogata didn't move. He spoke again, louder this time. "Listen to me. The war is ending. Your emperor will need men to rebuild Japan. The dead cannot rebuild a nation." The cave was silent. Then faintly came a voice, "Lies. Americans kill prisoners." Ogata shook his head. "No. You saw the ones from Mabuni. They live. Come see for yourself." Another long pause. Then, movement. Shadows. 2 young soldiers, barely 18, stumbled out with their hands up, trembling. Behind them came a wounded man on a makeshift stretcher. Ogata ordered medics forward. The sight stunned the Americans. No gunfire, no grenades, just surrender. Hours later, more emerged. By sunset, 27 men had walked out of that cave alive. That night, Ogata sat on an ammo crate, drenched and shaking. He was exhausted, haunted by every scream he'd heard and every life he hadn't saved. A medic handed him coffee. "You did good work today," the man said quietly. Ogata stared into the cup. "They don't even know why I speak their language," he murmured. For many of the Nisei linguists, the irony was painful. Only 3 years earlier, some of their families had been forced into internment camps back home. Their loyalty questioned, their freedom stripped. Yet here they were, saving lives on both sides, using words instead of bullets. In the days that followed, more caves fell silent. More soldiers surrendered. American reports credited artillery and firepower, but in truth, it was the voice of the interpreters that broke the will to die. When the last cave at Mabuni was cleared, a reporter for Stars and Stripes wrote, "They said the Japanese would never surrender. They were wrong. All it took was someone who could speak to them in their own tongue." Later, Colonel Yahara would be among the few senior Japanese officers to survive the battle. He would testify that he had surrendered because, for the first time, the enemy showed understanding, not of tactics but of spirit. He remembered the rain, the voice, the promise of mercy. He never learned the interpreter's name. In the official history of the Battle of Okinawa, these events were barely mentioned. The record spoke of casualties and tonnage dropped, not of words spoken through a storm. But for those who were there, it was clear. The war's most unlikely victory was not won by fire, but by language. One interpreter later wrote in his diary, "I never carried a rifle, but I fought a war. My weapon was trust. The Japanese called it kotoba no heiki, the weapon of words, and on that rain-soaked island it saved more lives than any gun." As the American flag rose over Okinawa, Ogata stood at the ridge and looked down at the caves now silent, filled with men who had chosen to live. The war was ending, but he knew another battle was waiting, one to prove that the sons of the very people America had imprisoned had also helped bring the bloodshed to an end. He folded his muddy helmet under his arm, whispered a quiet prayer for the dead, and walked back into the fog. Because in a war built on misunderstanding, he had done the impossible. He made the enemy listen. The Battle of Okinawa ended on June 22, 1945. 82 days of unrelenting slaughter, bombardment, and flame had left the island in ruins. Over 2,500 Americans were dead. The Japanese losses were staggering. More than 100,000 soldiers and nearly 90,000 civilians, either killed in the fighting or driven to suicide by fear and propaganda. It was the costliest battle of the Pacific War. Yet amid that devastation, one quiet truth began to surface, a truth born not of bullets, but of understanding. In the final weeks of the battle, U.S. intelligence officers discovered that the number of Japanese soldiers surrendering had increased sharply, from mere dozens early in the campaign to several thousand near the end. Official reports later linked this change to the psychological warfare leaflets, broadcasts, and most importantly, the voice interpreters who had risked their lives at the front. The Military Intelligence Service, the secretive group of Japanese-American linguists who had served across the Pacific and was finally recognized within the military command structure. Their methods had saved lives on both sides. When the news reached General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters, a memo was circulated through GHQ noting, "The presence of Japanese-speaking personnel has demonstrably hastened surrenders and reduced the necessity of direct combat in several instances." But those words, typed in formal language, could never convey the emotional reality behind them. For the Nisei interpreters who had survived Okinawa, returning to base was bittersweet. They were soldiers without a nation's full acceptance, heroes whose families were still living behind barbed wire in the internment camps of Manzanar, Topaz, and Heart Mountain. Letters from home told of resentment, suspicion, and silence. Some families didn't even know what their sons were doing overseas, because their missions were classified. Still, they kept going. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945 and Japan lay in ashes, it was the interpreters who stepped into a new kind of battlefield, the occupation. From the smoking ruins of Tokyo, Osaka, and Hiroshima, they became the translators, intermediaries, and human bridges between conqueror and conquered. They helped disarm soldiers, locate mines, translate surrender terms, and interpret orders from Allied command. Some stood in front of microphones broadcasting messages to millions of civilians in Japanese. Lay down your arms. The war is over. Go home to your families. Others walked through the rubble of towns, speaking softly to mothers who refused to believe the emperor had surrendered. It was the interpreters who entered the imperial palace with MacArthur's team. It was they who translated the orders that dissolved the Japanese military. And it was they who read the captured diaries of soldiers, diaries filled with shame, confusion, and grief. One entry found near Shuri read simply, "I heard the voice of a man speaking our language, but he was American. I wanted to hate him. I could not." His words were kind. For many of the Japanese survivors, surrender to the Americans had been unimaginable, until they heard compassion spoken in familiar tones. That more than any weapon broke the final psychological wall. In a debriefing report months later, a U.S. colonel noted that the interpreters succeeded where our leaflets failed. They convinced the enemy that surrender could be honorable, and that single shift, from suicide to survival, saved thousands. By the war's end, more than 6,000 Nisei linguists had served across the Pacific. They translated over 20 million pages of documents, intercepted radio codes, interrogated prisoners, and shaped nearly every Allied decision from New Guinea to Tokyo Bay. Their work shortened the war and saved countless lives. Yet most of their stories never appeared in newspapers. For years, the details of their service remained sealed under military classification. They were ghosts in America's victory narrative, remembered by few, understood by even fewer. But for those who fought alongside them, their memory endured. A Marine who survived Okinawa later wrote in a letter home, "Those boys who spoke Japanese, they saved us more times than I can count. We used to call them the men who fought with voices." The summer of 1945 brought both victory and reckoning. Japan lay in ruins, cities leveled by fire, industries reduced to ash, millions displaced. And yet, amid the collapse, the work of rebuilding had to begin immediately. In those first fragile months of occupation, chaos reigned. The Japanese language, filled with layers of honorifics, social hierarchies, and regional dialects, became both a bridge and a barrier between occupier and occupied. Orders could be misunderstood. Tempers could ignite. Every word mattered. That was where the Nisei interpreters became indispensable once more. They accompanied American officers through the scorched streets of Tokyo, Yokohama, and Kure, translating not only language but intent. They mediated surrender negotiations with officers still wearing their swords. They helped demobilize entire divisions, ensuring discipline was maintained. Some worked in the interrogation rooms of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, where they translated confessions, witness testimonies, and evidence from the very generals they had once fought against. Others served in hospitals, translating for wounded civilians or repatriated soldiers returning from China and the Philippines. Everywhere, they were the invisible hands guiding an uncertain peace. One interpreter later recalled standing inside a schoolhouse converted into a command post in 1946. A Japanese officer, stripped of his rank insignia, had refused to remove his sword. The American colonel was ready to arrest him, until the interpreter quietly explained that the sword had belonged to the man's father, and surrendering it without ceremony would mean losing his family's honor. The colonel paused. He allowed the officer to lay it down gently with a bow. No one spoke after that, but the tension dissolved. A potential riot was avoided. One gesture of understanding carried by words. Acts like that became the unseen foundation of Japan's reconstruction. The interpreters had turned the language of war into the language of peace. As years passed, many of them returned home to America. Some resumed quiet lives, working in businesses or government. Others joined the occupation administration permanently, helping rebuild Japan's education and civil systems. A few stayed in the intelligence community, shaping the early Cold War understanding of East Asia, but recognition came slowly. In the United States, memories of wartime fear still lingered. The internment camps had closed, but their shadow remained. The Nisei veterans rarely spoke about their service. Some never told their children at all. Their medals sat in drawers, their names missing from the headlines. It wasn't until 1972, nearly 30 years later, that the story began to resurface. A declassified report from the Department of the Army revealed the full scale of the Military Intelligence Service's contribution. The document concluded that the Nisei linguists had shortened the war by 2 years and saved possibly 1 million lives. 2 years, 1 million lives. Those were not just numbers, they were the measure of words. In 1988, when the U.S. government formally apologized for the wartime internment of Japanese Americans, many of the surviving interpreters were old men. Some attended the ceremony quietly, medals pinned to faded jackets. Others had already passed away, their legacy recorded only in footnotes. But their work had changed history. Without them, battles like Okinawa might have ended in total annihilation. Without them, Japan's surrender might have come later, at even greater cost. And without them, post-war reconciliation might never have taken root. A few historians began calling them the translators of peace. Others, the silent heroes. In 2000, the U.S. Congress recognized the Military Intelligence Service with a unit citation for extraordinary heroism, professional skill, and devotion to duty. The honor came decades late, but it came. At the ceremony, one veteran spoke simply, "We were Americans. We just happened to speak Japanese." Today their legacy endures not in monuments or battle maps, but in the fragile peace between two nations that once sought to destroy each other. Their voices, carried across rain, fire, and hatred, became proof that even in the darkest moments of war, humanity could still be heard. The caves of Okinawa are silent now, their walls marked by time and moss. But if you stand there long enough in the humid stillness, you can almost imagine it again. A faint echo, a calm voice in Japanese calling through the smoke. A moment when a man lowered his weapon and chose to live. War is often remembered by its noise, the thunder of artillery, the whine of aircraft, the screams of men in chaos. But sometimes history turns on silence, and on the quiet courage of those who spoke when others could not. The story of the Japanese-American interpreters is not one of glory or conquest. It is one of humanity. In a time when hatred and suspicion divided nations, and even families, they chose understanding as their weapon. They proved that victory is not only measured in ground gained or enemies defeated, but in the lives spared through compassion and clarity. On Okinawa, it was not a general or a machine that halted the killing. It was a voice, clear, calm, familiar, reaching across the smoke and fear to remind soldiers on both sides that they were still human. That single truth remains the quiet legacy of those men. When the war ended, the world moved on to new rivalries and new frontiers, but the interpreter's lesson endures in every negotiation, every peace treaty, every fragile truce that depends on words instead of weapons. They showed that understanding the language of your enemy is not weakness. It is strength of the highest order. Many of them never sought recognition. They faded into history's background, their names lost beneath the weight of more visible heroes. But in every war since, from Korea to Afghanistan, their legacy has whispered through the ranks of every linguist, mediator, and peacekeeper who believes that communication can prevent destruction. Today, when historians speak of the Battle of Okinawa, they often mention its bloodshed, its scale, its horror. Yet behind that, another story waits, of translators standing amid the chaos offering a chance at mercy. Because in the end, language did what armies could not. It ended the dying, and as one surviving interpreter once said, standing before the caves decades later, his voice trembling with age and memory, "If they heard me, even for a moment, if they chose life because of that, then that was enough." The Pacific War left ruins across oceans and generations. But among those ruins, a few words gone spoken in understanding and still echo. And they remind us that even in war, the greatest victory is not conquest. It is communication.